All right. 1 Samuel chapter 8 is where we are this evening. And
Time for a king.
yeah, Israel is looking for a king. And before we tangle with this one, you might want to kind of keep your finger in that, but look in Deuteronomy chapter 17. In Deuteronomy 17, beginning in verse 14. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. And if you continue, it gives you the requirements. It says basically that whoever the king would be was not allowed to have a large harem, nor was he allowed to have a lot of horses, of all things. God actually said there in Deuteronomy chapter 17 that whoever the king of Israel would be wasn't allowed to have a lot of horses. Now, we know that King David and King Solomon both violated that. Now, the reason that God told them not to have a lot of horses, because you would think that's kind of a strange prohibition. Why wouldn't the king be allowed to have a lot of horses? Well, God was limiting their ability to conduct war. What's that?
Yep.
To battle.
Yeah, limiting their ability to
Horses lead to
conduct warfare.
chariots.
Well, two things. Number one, it not only does it eliminate having a chariot, but it severely limits your ability to have a cavalry.
Yep. And your battle mobility.
And your battle mobility. If you're going
God
to
wanted
fight,
them to be dependent upon Him.
that's exactly the reason God told them to do that. Because God wanted them to get it through their heads that they were there to conduct battle according to God's directive. They were not allowed to just decide for themselves how they would conduct warfare. And obviously the prohibition on having too many wives, number one, Christ himself made it clear that having multiple wives of any number was not God's will. And certainly having multiple wives, as Solomon did, was to prevent them from getting waylaid by the religious preferences of the wives. But even
Which
King
happened
David,
quite a bit.
but even King David, who didn't have anywhere near as many wives as Solomon did, still, by the time he had had a successful career, if you want to call it that, as a king, had several wives. Not a whole pile of them, but too many. Now, with this in mind, the whole point of that was while God's desire and his will for them was that they would look to God as being their king and that they would not require an earthly king. But God had foreseen from the beginning that the time would come when they would in fact demand a king. And that's what we see here in chapter 8. Now, back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, it says, And it came about, when Samuel was old, that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now, it's interesting here that already just 8 chapters into it, it already says Samuel was old. So now, the general consensus is that Samuel wrote the majority of this, but obviously a good bit of at least certainly 2 Samuel, probably not written by Samuel because it covers events after Samuel's dead and gone. And obviously by chapter 8 here, it already says that he's old and now appoints his sons as judges. However, what do you see here as different as far as being a judge over Israel that Samuel has done here that goes against what we saw in the book of Judges?
God's chosen all the judges.
Yeah. In the book of Judges, it was God who raised up a judge, whereas here Samuel has appointed his two sons to be judges. And we don't see any indication that God told Samuel to do that. Now, verse 2 says, the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. Now, keep in mind, Beersheba is in southern Israel. That's all the way on the other side of the country from where Samuel was. Ramah is in northern Israel. Beersheba is at the southern tip of Israel. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. Now, where have we heard this before?
Eli.
Yeah. How many times do we see that godly men turn out to be bad fathers?
Are they really bad fathers, though, or are they just end up with bad kids?
Well, maybe, but
I know Eli did some stuff that
Eli,
he
but
tolerated stuff that he shouldn't have.
he tolerated stuff he shouldn't have, and we're even told in the chapter we earlier studied that Eli's sons did not know the Lord. Now, whose fault was that?
Eli's.
That was Eli's fault. And here, clearly, Samuel's sons, we don't know if they knew God or not, but they certainly were not godly men. So there's, again, we can't state with authority at this point that Samuel's responsible for that. But it just seems there's so many times that we have men who fail as far, or at least end up raising kids that don't follow God. King David himself had half his sons were not godly men. The rebellion in the Davidic kingdom was one of David's own sons.
And that's still prevalent today
Mm-hmm.
with ministers.
My study notes say, like Eli, Samuel neglected his sons. Perhaps like many servants of God, he was away from home too much and too busy trying to help others. He failed to notice the trouble signs.
And that's a possibility. And my question would have been, why didn't Samuel take his boys with him when he went out circuit riding? We have no indication that he did that.
I've been watching really rewatching for the second time a really good TV series, and in it it's about building the railroad across the U.S. in 1800s, and the guy who's the spearhead guy driving the railroad magnate guy, he makes a comment to one of the other characters in this story about how great men often make poor fathers.
No, they're too busy working.
Yeah.
All right, anyway, verse 4 says, Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. Now, obviously, God had foreseen this happening. So, there was already a provision in the law of Moses for this to occur. What most theologians have said is probably the sin in this was not that they asked for a king, because again, the law of Moses made a provision for it. It's that they made it very specific that they wanted a king so that they could be like all the other nations around them. That was what most theologians say is true. Now, we do see, and we'll see this as we continue on into chapter 8, that God basically pointed the finger back at them when Samuel approaches God and says, well, the problem is it's me, not you, that they have rejected. So we see that they wanted a king so they could be like everybody else, and that it is God's kingship itself that they are displeased with. Verse 6 says, but the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. Now, Samuel clearly sees that obviously this is a rejection of God and of his leadership as the judge. But to Samuel's credit, notice what the first thing Samuel did whenever they approached him.
Pray.
He said, let me pray about this. So this tells us that at least, even if Samuel may have not been the father that he should have been, he certainly still had his heart right with God and knew that the first thing he needed to do was to go talk to God about this. And the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them. Now, I've always found this to be an interesting concept that God says at this point, they've rejected me as king, but then how many times have we already seen prophecies in the Bible, even before this, that has said that the ultimate king would in fact be
Messiah.
the Son of God himself? So even though God is saying they've rejected me as king, God's already got the provisions in place where, guess what? You're going to get a king, and it's going to come full circle where it's going to be me. Like all the deeds, it's verse 8, like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now, what's the parallel in this for us today?
Well,
We're living in an exact parallel to this.
absolutely.
Because what did Jesus say to his disciples about their rejection of him?
He'll reject you too.
He said they're going to hate you because they hate me. And they'll reject you because they've rejected me.
It's interesting to me that God didn't choose to discipline them, that he gave them the rope to hang themselves.
That's exactly what we see. An interesting way that you described that. God did, in fact, give, as we'll see, as we move on into chapter 9, God gave them exactly what they wanted, and even right down to the specifics of someone just like those people around you, and God just stood back and gave them just enough rope for them to hang themselves.
And I want to add a little more when you say, I mean, I look at these people and they're worshiping idols, and that's what you got. You got to return to these gods now. I mean, people worship everything but the true God now, whether it be communism. There are tons of religions out there right now. None of them center around the
Well,
Lord.
it's an interesting parallel in my life because in my life I've had to learn most things the hard way. I'm hard-headed, you know, and God knew they needed to learn. They had to learn it the hard way. He couldn't just teach it to them. He couldn't just tell them this is how it's going to be. You don't want to go down that path. They wouldn't have listened.
Well, actually,
Free will.
as we, if you've read ahead, that's exactly what Samuel does.
Yeah, Samuel gives them the warning.
He told them. He
So
said,
you
all right,
careful what you're asking for.
verse 9 says, now then listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them. Or in other words, some version of the Bible say the custom, procedure, same word. But in other words, warn them about what's going to happen. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. And he said, this will be the procedure or the custom of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. Now, stop right there. Notice part of the warning here. Samuel tells them that he's going to take them to be infantrymen that are going to have to run alongside the king's chariots. Now, if the king's got chariots, he's got horses, which again goes directly against what we just read in Deuteronomy 17 that God told them, don't do that. So we see that Samuel's already telling them that if you get a king over yourself, he's going to lead you to rebel and to violate the law of Moses. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing, and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war, and equipment for his chariots. In other words, he said, you're going to get yourself drafted. He's basically warning them of a draft. Said he will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. And he will take 1/10 of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants.
Taxes.
Now, not only taxes, but notice he says he's going to take 1/10. God already said the first 1/10 is mine. So what he's saying here is that instead of tithing to me, you're going to be tithing to the king. The king's going to take 10%. Well, what's the implication there that Samuel's telling him about?
The king's going to usurp God's role.
Okay, so the king's going to take what belongs to me. Okay, because I'm the one that ought to be getting the 10th, not the king. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. He's basically warning them that the whole lot of you are going to end up in servitude to the king. By the way, where have we seen this before? Joseph. Under the leadership of Joseph, Joseph wrangled it in such a way that the entire nation of Egypt was in servitude to Pharaoh. So it's not like they hadn't seen this happen before. They knew the story of Joseph, and they probably knew exactly how Egypt wound up in servitude to Pharaoh, and that before it was over with, they were enslaved to Pharaoh. So he's telling them stuff that they should have already known. And you know what? The whole, the adage that you hear from people that, that we never learn from history and history repeats itself. Well, apparently that's not, as Solomon himself later said, nothing new under the sun.
You just don't have the right.
I'm thinking if only it had remained 1/10.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the percentage we pay to the government now.
You've never been to Europe, have you?
No.
Not really.
Do a little study of some European governments.
Over 50%.
Oh yeah, there's some. Sweden is the highest has the highest tax rate of any place in Europe, and yeah, I think it's 50%.
Canada's pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
Well, look
But
at
even in the
communists.
U.S., for people who are high earners, that percentage climbs.
Yeah.
The people that are communists now, they want to be communists, and they've seen this. Everyone's seen it. What happens?
Yeah, under a communist government, you don't get to own anything.
Yeah, they take it all.
You could consider that a 100% tax rate, because whatever you've got, the government's coming to get.
The Democrats are voting for communists,
Mm-hmm.
big time.
Well, they may get what, unfortunately,
Yes, for
at least in places like New York and California, they may get their wish.
just
Yeah,
like this.
looks like it.
Same thing.
The other thing that they're already dealing with in New York is the rich people that they're wanting to tax have seen the handwriting on the wall, and the rich people are leaving in droves. And now, like in the city of New York,
And so are all the conservatives. The only
Yeah.
people going to be left in those states are the Democrats.
and they're going to be looking around wondering who's going to pay the bills.
Exactly.
Margaret
There ain't going to be
Thatcher.
any money to steal from anybody.
Uh-huh.
Margaret Thatcher.
Yep. All right, verse 18 says, "Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. In other words, God's telling them, you do this, you suffer the consequences for it. He's telling them up front, this is what's going to happen, and when it happens, don't come crying to me.
But they didn't listen.
Yeah.
They didn't listen, right?
Mhm.
I mean, they still wanted the king even
Yeah.
after he warned them. So
Yeah, it says, verse 19 tells us that. It says, nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, this was the sin in what they did. They said, not only do we want a king like all the other nations, notice verse 20 says, we want to be like all these other nations. God had told them, no, you are to come out and be separate. You're my people. You belong to me. You're not to be like any of these other nations. And they're saying, no, we want to be like all these other nations.
and they became like them.
And that was the sin they committed. If they had gone to Samuel, I think, and I'm speculating here, but I think if they had gone to Samuel and said, we'd like to have a king, you know, we saw what happened with Eli, and now your sons are doing the same thing. You're getting old. We'd like to have a king, but we would like to have a king that will direct us to God. We would like to have a king that will lead us spiritually. I think God would have probably said, you know what? Not a problem. We'll take care of that. But it was their specific request that we want to be not closer to God. We want to be like everybody else. That's where they went wrong. And God, as you said earlier, God gave them just enough rope to let them hang themselves. And he told them, says, when it happens and you wake up one day and realize what you've done, don't come crying to me, because I'm not going to rescue you. Verse 20 says that we may also be like all the nations, that our king may judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles. So again, they're thinking the king's going to do it for them, and Samuel's just told them, no, he's going to constrict all of you to make you go do it. And they didn't get that. Now, after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. Well, now, obviously, God already knew about this, but Samuel, again, did the right thing. He did not make any decision here. Samuel goes back and spends some time in prayer. And the Lord said to Samuel, listen to their voice and appoint them a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. So Samuel has gone back to them and basically told them, God has granted your request, go home. Now, obviously they trusted Samuel because they were willing to go home and leave it to Samuel to figure out who this king was going to be, which will be told about in chapter 9. But Samuel's on the right track here. He spends time in prayer and does exactly what God told him to do. Samuel's failure, and again, I think this goes to show, at least in my opinion, that Samuel may have been a great man of God, a good prophet, but I still think he was a failure as a father, because what started all of this?
His boys were not on God's way.
His boys were judging on the other side of the country in ways that were dishonest. It was brought to Samuel's attention. Do you see anything in here where Samuel says, you know what, let me go have a talk with these boys and we'll deal with this problem? He doesn't.
Probably because it was already too late. His boys were adults by then, and they were set in their ways. They had already set their
But
values.
there was one
The
thing,
good talking to from Dad wasn't going to change him.
but there was still something Samuel did have the authority to do.
Remove
could
them
have-
as judges.
Exactly. He could have called them in and said, guess what, guys? You messed up. You are no longer a judge. Go home. You're fired. He didn't do that.
Eli could have done the same thing.
And Eli could have done the same thing. you would have thought that Samuel, who grew up under Eli's tutelage, who saw what Eli's sons did, would have known better.
Didn't learn from them.
So it just amazes me how many times we see godly men in the Bible that still, they have that one blind spot that they just can't seem to get past. We saw, well, I won't say we saw it with Eli. Eli was himself dishonest. But we see it with Samuel. We see it with King David. We see it with Solomon. And how many times do we see, from people after that godly men, and Sherry hit it on the button here earlier. You talk about a lot of pastors. They spend so much time being godly, they forget to raise their kids. Billy Graham, not due to anything Billy Graham did, but Franklin Graham. By Franklin Graham's own admission, when he was younger, he was a rebel.
Yep.
He ran from God. It wasn't Billy Graham's tutelage that got Franklin Graham where he was today. Franklin Graham came to Christ simply because he got right with God on his own later. And you asked Billy, well, in fact, I should say you asked, Billy Graham was asked several times that if he had anything that he regretted that he would have done differently. His answer was consistent. He said, I should have spent more time at home.
I've seen some recent YouTube videos attacking Franklin Graham because and portraying him as a hypocrite, because they're looking back at his actions when he was a rebel and comparing that now and saying, oh, he's a hypocrite. They don't realize that the transformation that takes place when someone finds their way to God.
Exactly.
So,
They always do that.
yeah.
Because they don't want to repent themselves.
Well,
Exactly.
not only that, but people
They
who
don't
are
want to believe in repentance.
But people who haven't repented or who don't know God to begin with think that it's, once a rebel, always a rebel. They don't get that God does change people.